Well, thanks for taking time out of your day for this, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to participate on this trip. So I'm going to try and move the slides along from here. Hopefully that works out all right, and make some comments along the way. So we were a group of 31 people connected to Grebel through a variety of ways. Some were former or current staff, students, or parents of students. On the right-hand side, you see Troy Osborne, who was one of our tour leaders. It was follow the yellow clipboard when we were on our walkabout tours. Our focus was a historical religious pilgrimage of sorts, and often in urban settings. I tend to be I like to do vacations in the countryside and in natural and scenic areas, so it was new for me to do a lot of urban walking about and so forth, but I really learned to love the architecture, and of course, right away, I was struck by the architecture. We began our tour, our 2-week tour in Amsterdam, and focused on the Dutch branch of the Anabaptist Mennonite story. And right away, I was taken with this old architecture and the artisticness of it, and loved to try and take it in through pictures. So this was in the city center of Amsterdam. Some other pictures of Amsterdam. I love the fact that one of those buildings is actually leaning. They're so old. Some typical scenes from Amsterdam. Loved the scenes that we began our tour with a walking tour of the historical part of the city with its canals and bridges and cobblestone streets and narrow, colorful houses. So picturesque, and I think that was our longest day in terms of walking. Of course, everybody had their step counters, and at the end of the day, nobody could agree on how many steps we'd taken. And somebody figured we did about 9K that day, which was about our longest. There's our group on one of the canal bridges. So here we are at you'll notice the sign Dooptgezinde, which means baptism-minded, single kerk, which is a church, and it's actually a church that continues to function, built in 1608. Gets its name from the canal on which it is located. And this would have been one of the hidden churches. Its facade from the outside does not indicate that a whole church is back behind there with balconies and a raised pulpit. Anabaptists were tolerated later in Dutch history, but needed to abide by certain rules, which included not having publicly visible worship spaces. So from the street, you couldn't really tell that this was a place of worship. It is still functioning as a church today, and that's where we met our tour guide, Nina Schrader, who's originally from Winnipeg, who came to Amsterdam to study art and never left. And so she met us at the church, gave us some background, and then did a bunch of other stuff with us. Again, it's so astounding that you don't see anything of this from the street. You have no idea that this is behind the facade. So there's Nina, our tour guide in Amsterdam. And the other thing she showed us upstairs is one of the oldest Mennonite historical libraries and archives were held up there in the church. So that was another unique feature of this trip, was getting to see a number of the archives and collections that are in Europe on the Anabaptist Mennonite story. The other thing that Nina did, she was an art student, and so she took us to the Rijksmuseum, where the finest collection of Dutch Golden Age art is housed by world-renowned artists like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Jan Steen. You can see there, those artists are in the stained glass picture. What a stunning building. She gave us a 1-hour guided tour of that collection, highlighting several works by Mennonite artists or with Mennonites as subjects. And then we had another hour to look around on our own, and it would have required many more hours to appreciate everything. I liked this one because it portrayed Mennonites as being so the picture on the right is of this Mennonite family living in harmony. And then on the left is this scene of sort of a chaotic family scene. And so the Mennonites here are portrayed as harmonious and having it all together somehow. I thought that was interesting. And then just some other ways that Mennonites were portrayed. When we talk about the Golden Age in the Netherlands, we are talking about in 1570 was the formation of the Dutch Republic, and they talk about the Golden Age being this time when there was much prosperity and so forth. But the Golden Age also has a dark side, as Dutch ships plied the slave trade and merchants profited from resources taken from colonized lands. And by that time, Mennonites too had gained wealth and status in the city and benefited from colonialism. So there's another time in history where one description of history maybe hides the reality of what was actually going on. So I just was taken by, some of these great Dutch artists. Wished I would have had more art history background on this part of the tour. We then had a canal boat tour, about 90-minute tour of the Amsterdam Canal system. It was really nice to relax and rest our feet. And from here we could see so much more of the unique Dutch architecture. And the boat has a low top because we need to be able to get under those bridges. So that's our group on the canal boat. And my traveling companion was my sister Nancy. Many of you know Nancy. She and I can be mistaken for each other at points, as you can tell. So it was great to experience this with my sister. So that was the end of our time in Amsterdam, and then we moved on to a little farther up on the sea coast, and this was our second hotel where we stayed, and it was right on the water, and we learned a lot about how the Dutch culture is all about figuring out how to manage water. Because, of course, the Netherlands, the lowlands, that's what it means, is below sea level. So this was, we moved on to the story of, I just have to find my spot in my notes. I'm apologizing here. Page turned over. Okay. This is the village of Asperen, where we met a local historian who took us on a walking tour and narrated the story of Anabaptist Dirk Willems, who was imprisoned in a castle and who managed to escape across water next to the castle that had frozen. Our tour guide told us there was a period of, this story was reported to have taken place in May, and our tour guide told us that there was a period of cooling in that era, so a frozen lake in May was possible. Willems managed to escape across the ice, but his pursuer fell through. Willems returned across the ice to rescue his pursuer, who, according to our tour guide, would have known him from town life, and while somebody in the castle above insisted that the guard arrest Willems, so Willems was imprisoned in the local church tower for a few days before being executed. This is that church, and we climbed up the tower. We also saw the site where the castle would have stood and the place where the water would have been frozen over. This is still another visual inside the church. Here's our tour guide telling us the story. And there's the location of the story and the depiction of it in the Martyr's Mirror. So then we actually climbed the 5 stories up a winding enclosed staircase of bricks into the church tower for an expansive view at the top and to see the room where Willems was likely imprisoned. And just to feel the story a little bit more, we put our other tour leader, David Neufeld, in the stocks, just to show how Willems might have been imprisoned in that church tower. and a couple of views. I love the Dutch landscape. It's very flat, but it was so unique in its own right. All the different parts of Europe that we experienced were so beautiful. I was so struck by that. There's again the church tower, which we climbed up, and the landscape that you can see from there. All right. Then we drove on to a traditional Dutch village of Zaanschans. It's a tourist destination. It has lots of shops, working windmills, a bakery, a wooden shoe museum. You can buy any color, shape, size of wooden shoe you want there, and a cheese factory. So we had some free time there to enjoy. These are marvels of engineering. And of course, the farmer roots in me, I had to take pictures of the cows. There's a lot of dairy cows in the Netherlands. One of the things we learned is that they are encouraged to maintain some of the more traditional practices of dairy farming, so cows out on pasture rather than kept in the barn. And there's a premium for your milk if you raise your cattle that way. So we saw lots of cows on pasture. One of the other things I wanted to point out to you, the picture on the right shows up at the top of the building there's a hook. And so in Dutch architecture, there's a hook at the top of the building because that's how you winch stuff up to get it into the upper floors, because the stairways inside the buildings are too narrow to carry, big pieces of furniture and stuff up. So you have a hook and a winch system. Also one of the many cheese factories and places we bought great cheese to sample. And then we traveled on to across the Afsluitdijk Dam and Causeway into Friesland, so the northern part of the country. This spans about 32 kilometers between North Holland and Friesland, and it was built to protect coastal towns and create the freshwater lake. And so again, we were reminded about how the Netherlands are reclaimed lands below sea level, and the focus of infrastructure projects in this country is all about managing water. You can also see here a windmill project. So our next day we began in Witmersum, where Menno Simons served as a priest. We met our 2 tour guides at the church where Menno Simons would have been a priest. It's still functioning as a congregation today. And that's the church. And on the inside, and they had these interesting panels on swinging metal arms that came out into the church space. That was a whole display about Menno Simons and the Anabaptists, and then that could be folded back in when they use the church on a Sunday morning. But clearly they do a great deal of tourist interpretation for tourists and for Anabaptist pilgrims. And I couldn't resist standing in Menno's pulpit. Just wanted to see what that might feel like. So this is the display that swings out. So quite an extensive interpretive display about Menno Simons and the Anabaptist movement. That's my niece, Catherine, who is a pastor now, or niece-in-law, I guess I would call her. She's a pastor at Hillcrest, so we thought maybe 2 women in the pulpit was better than 1. All right. Next, we visited a flour mill, the Ondernijming. This was a traditional windmill, and our host there was a young woman with a passion for traditional bread making. She told us her story, how she started there as a volunteer and eventually developed it into her own business. We got a tour of the windmill and its workings, and its incredible technology and engineering. And they grow Turkey red wheat, which originated in Ukraine, then went with Mennonites to Ohio and Kansas, and is now back in Friesland. And so she told they grind the grain with the traditional workings of the windmill, and then she bakes the bread. So that was quite an interesting tour. All right. Next, we traveled to Pingjum to visit a hidden Anabaptist church. Again, as in parts of the Reformation, there was a little bit more or less religious tolerance, and so you could have a church, but again, not have any visible signs that it was a church on the outside of the building. That's the church on the inside. And our tour guide, some of you know Rosalie Steinman from the New Hamburg, Tavistock area. This is her husband, Johannes, who she met in the Netherlands, and he's a retired pastor from there. And this was the first place where we all sang together as a group. He asked us if we could sing, Praise God from whom all blessings flow. And so that was kind of a neat experience in this little church. He also told us that in the tradition, the men would have sat around the outside and the women would have sat in the middle. We also visited a monument to Menno Simons and a nearby open steel painted sculpture in the shape of a church, which you'll see in a couple more pictures, commemorating the spot where the Whitmarsum Mennonite meeting house once stood, and it would have replaced an older hidden meeting house. It's not probable that Menno Simons ever preached here, which is interesting because the plaques allude to that, make it sound like he actually would have preached here. But this would have been the area where Menno was active as an Anabaptist pastor. So it's interesting to ask the question, what kind of monuments should we put up to Anabaptist leaders? Somebody, for a movement that has so much simplicity in its theology, to put up monuments seems kind of counterintuitive in some ways. There's the sculpture that they've put up where the Whitmarsum meeting house would have once stood. So it just kind of commemorates that spot. And it is fascinating because Europe is so secularized, but in so many places there is so much emphasis put on commemorating these historical religious sites, which is fascinating. We traveled then to the town of Berlicum, where we were warmly welcomed for supper in the church, along with our host families, followed by a worship time with them. So this is an active Mennonite church. They hosted us and served us supper and hosted us overnight. And then we realized later they were doing the same thing the next day for another group. So there was a lot of activity in Europe in these couple of weeks leading up to the commemoration in Switzerland. That's our group with our hosts. All right, then we moved on to Geithorn, which is sometimes known as the Venice of the North. It's a village of canals, bridges, and walking paths. People get around using small boats on the canal, and there was actually a Mennonite church there on one of the canal intersections. So that would be kind of cool to float up to church in a boat. Traditional thatched roofs still used in the Netherlands. All right, then it was on into Germany, into the city of Munster in Germany, and we toured the downtown around the cathedral and visited the city museum and heard about one of the darker times in Anabaptist history. So there was an apocalyptic flavor to the movement in the Netherlands from the beginning, and based on the influence of Melchior Hoffman, and it eventually culminated in a radical, revolutionary-minded wing of the movement taking over the city of Munster in Germany in the hopes of establishing an Anabaptist kingdom, and it all came to a terrible end in 1535 in violent circumstances. And so we, in Munster, there's a museum where you can hear about this history, about the Anabaptist uprising. And then we were also able to go into the cathedral. And then the St. Lambert's Church Tower still has cages on the side of the building. Many of you have heard this story before, where the Anabaptists who were the leaders of this revolution were, their bodies were hung in these cages. And the cages remain. And so it's an interesting question to ask, it's a disturbing story, brings about, it makes you wonder about, how significant that story was for that to still be part of their history and still be part of their visible history. So it really did affect the Anabaptist movement. It raised a lot of harsh treatment and assumptions about Anabaptists throughout Europe for years to come after that. For some people, it is all they know about the movement, and the whole experience raises questions about where's the line between radical reform and extremism. We did travel to Cologne, Germany, to see the twin-towered Gothic cathedral. These cathedrals are awe-inspiring, magnificent, represent such amazing ingenuity and engineering, and then so much beautiful artwork, stained glass windows, tapestries, ornamentation, and statues. Such a difference compared to our Anabaptist simplicity. We also had the opportunity to take a boat tour on the Rhine River. And I'm going to run through the next slides fairly quickly. We had weather that made for some great scenes. The sky was quite moody, and so there's some great scenes with castles and churches and vineyards, and I was just going a little, I was trying to be a photographer for a while. But it's really striking how central church is in the European landscape, right? Everywhere you look, there's churches, and yet the culture has become much more secularized. I know some of you have traveled in Germany, have been on the Rhine River. It is just so beautiful. Really enjoyed this afternoon. We disembarked at Bingen and drove to Worms, where we enjoyed an authentic German meal of schnitzel, potatoes, and white asparagus in a cream sauce. I think it was after 9 before we got our food, and then a strawberry dessert to top it off. Oh my goodness, it was something. Asparagus is in season at the time we were there. It's quite a delicacy. That's a statue of Martin Luther in Worms. I'm not sure why I cut his head off and got more of the tour guide, Troy, underneath, but anyway, we did talk a lot about Martin Luther's part in the Reformation. On the left, you see what are called Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones. Concrete squares with a brass plate inscribed with the names and dates of victims of Nazi extermination or persecution during the Holocaust. So Jews who used to live at or near that location. So those were quite sobering when we came upon those. This day we spent a good part of the day at Weierhof, a semi-communal village in the Palatinate. We're still in the Rhine River watershed. Weierhof has a school that has been part of an exchange with Rockaway for many years. So that's another connection to our Mennonite tradition. This Weierhof included the home of the first Anabaptists to leave Switzerland as they fled. They were welcomed in this part of Germany, which had been devastated after the 30 Years' War, and they were looking for good farmers to restore the land to productivity. We were able to visit a church in this small town as well, and there is a small Mennonite congregation there today. This is the archives, an extensive, very detailed, well-curated archive of Anabaptist Mennonite history, and that's where we were able to touch and handle some of the oldest parts of our history. Martyr's Mirror, German Bibles, handwritten sermons. It's quite an impressive collection. On the right is a plate from the prints that were made in the Martyr's Mirror. And then these are some of the existing homes that would have been first settled here by Anabaptists. And I love the old architecture, and then the new, a plug-in for an EV. And also took note that in the cemetery, there were stones that we would consider Swiss, Russian, and Amish names. The families were intermixed back then in some ways, not all in the divided like we might think. Very picturesque little town. That's the church. And that's inside the church. Lovely scenic street. And that's the school that has an exchange with Rockaway. All right. So then it was off to the Sinsheim Castle, where we had lunch and climbed the tower for another awesome view. And this was lunch, and then we had to climb the castle. That didn't feel very good. Oh, German Spätzle noodles. A view from up there, and in this region too, lots of vineyards. Gorgeous landscape. We also drove to a Weber homestead. So any of you who have Weber ancestry, this might have been your people. Immelhof, it was called. Quite a few traditional buildings there, and a cellar. So that blue window that blue door on the right is the spot where there was a cellar where Anabaptists gathered to worship in secret. This building was in Steinsfurt, and there was another cellar under this building, and we heard the story of how John Ruth, a Mennonite historian, eventually learned of this location, and it was here that 53 Anabaptists were arrested in the 1600s for exceeding the restricted number of 12 persons who were allowed for a gathering. And in that space, our German guide asked us to sing Gott ist die Liebe, which was a lovely experience. Imagining, people gathering in that place for worship, for safety. This was a stop at one of the Reformed churches for refreshments and a washroom break. This happened quite frequently on our trip, and the Reformed church went above and beyond to welcome Anabaptists to Europe. They knew this was a significant commemoration, and they went out of their way to make us feel welcome, to prepare stops for us, refreshments and washroom breaks. So that was a very moving experience to connect with some of these Reformed church folks on the way. This was the inside of one of those churches. And it was on to Strasbourg, France. And we did a walking tour of the old part, the Petit France part of that city. Pilgrim Marpeck was a local Anabaptist leader here, and he represented a less separatist arm of the movement. And it was very interesting to see these half-timber building style structures, the colorful street fronts, and then we also walked around the Strasbourg Cathedral, which is one of the most impressive cathedrals in Europe. We'll get to that in a minute. So here's the street leading to the cathedral, and you'll notice that it only has a single spire. I guess they ran out of resources and funds and maybe workers to complete the second spire. But it is truly an impressive building. Ornate Gothic features, flying buttresses, and innovative in cathedral building at the time that allowed for stronger, higher walls and bigger windows to allow in more light. And it is actually the tallest structure in the world that was completed in the Middle Ages. This was one of the picturesque little towns that we drove through and were able to stop and do some touring and have lunch. This was the town of Riquewihr. All kinds of lovely desserts in the windows all the time. And then this was our Sunday morning. We visited the Langnau Mennonite Church in Switzerland now, which is the oldest continuous Anabaptist congregation. Most of the service was conducted in Swiss German, but there was also High German. Lots of young people in this service. And a very warm welcome, and it was fun to sing with that congregation. Then we are off to the Cambly Biscuit Store and Cafe. Some of you have been there and know what awaits you there. And we ran into a tour group there from EMU, Eastern Mennonite University, and so we kind of mirrored them for the rest of the day. So this was probably my favorite one of my favorite parts of the trip. We drove up into the Emmental Hills, which, according to my cousin Fred, there is record of Martin ancestors in the Emmental region. What a beautiful landscape, and an excellent place to hide if you're an Anabaptist on the run. We drove to Hinterhuten, a small traditional Swiss farm. They had 12 cows and about 1,000 chickens. Their cows' milk was sold for cheese. And Regula was our tour guide host there. She lives there with her husband and did extensive research and learned about the history and then preserved the Anabaptist story connected to their farm. She herself is not Anabaptist. She'd be part of the Reformed Church, but took it upon herself to preserve this story. So traditional Swiss house barn combination, and on the right is a picture of what they found was a hidden secret Anabaptist hiding place up in the barn, and that's what got her onto the story of the Anabaptists. So they've preserved this as a whole museum, traditional farm equipment, and some other displays. And this was the day we drove up into the hills and, hairpin turns with the bus, and I'm catching my breath at one point because of the scenery and at another point because it's a white-knuckle drive, in my opinion, around these corners. But a gorgeous, gorgeous place. And then we got right up into, this is a Reformed church up in the hills, and that's been preserved to try and preserve what it might have looked like in the Middle Ages. Lovely scene and beautiful cemetery, and again some traditional familiar names on gravestones. This is the Truxelveld Castle. So the deputy in charge of the area would follow up on tips to keep the population in line and would track down Anabaptists and imprison them in the castle tower. And we had time to explore the castle and see the prison rooms where Anabaptists would have been kept. And there was a map on the wall showing around 300 locations in the region where research has shown there were Anabaptists. And of course, we recognize many names from that. And that was our fondue supper night. So as they say in Switzerland, an excuse to eat bread and cheese together. Now we're off to Bern, Switzerland. So we did a walking tour of the city of Bern. And David Neufeld apologized that day. He said, most of the sites we'll look at today have to do with punishments of Anabaptists, where they would have been kept, some in orphanages, some in workhouses. We saw a place overlooking the river where some of them would have been drowned. That's that spot. And we saw government buildings where they would have been held in cells. Some were even sent on by way of France to be galley slaves on ships in the Mediterranean. And we also learned about Swiss politics, modern Swiss politics. This was also the bear pits for bear baiting, which was medieval entertainment. There's still a bear there today. This is the Thun Castle, another castle significant for its jurisdiction over the area. In the upper levels of the castle where prisoners would have been held, and there were 4 turrets up there that offered great views of the surrounding area. We climbed a lot of castle steps. And I couldn't resist taking this picture in that town, Zuchthaus zu Metzgern, so Metzger, and Bauman Gessli, Bauman Street. So of course these names still, we go back a long way. And we drove to Erlebach, the birthplace of Jacob Ammann, founder of the Amish branch of the Anabaptist movement, and here we boarded a gondola to take us to the Stockhorn summit, and 2 gondolas actually to get to the summit, and then a hike. It would have been a stunning view of the Swiss Alps from here, but it was cloudy. So at various places along the way, the clouds would break, and we'd catch a glimpse of what was a stunning view. But we didn't see the whole vista of it because there was a bit of cloud cover. So you can see on the left, the cloud cleared and we could see a bit, and then on the right, the cloud had moved in, and all you can see behind us is these clouds. That was our supper for the night, meatloaf. And then it was on to Zurich. We did a walking tour of Zurich the first day we were in town. This is the home of Conrad Grebel's father. And Conrad Grebel did live here for a certain number of years, so we thought it fitting that the Grebel group needed to have a picture in front of Grebel's house. This is the spot where, so our walking tour took us through Zurich. This is the location of the Froschauer printer, where the Froschauer Bible was printed that was popular with many Anabaptists, and where the sausage affair was reported to have taken place. If you remember my sermon about the eating sausage to instead of fasting during Lent as they were supposed to do. This is the Grossmünster Cathedral, where Ulrich Zwingli, the reformer, was a preaching pastor. And that's a statue of him on the left. The doors. And the area around the church was interesting. There was a lot of construction going on around the church. We did get inside on the day of our walking tour, so I do have a view from inside the church from that perspective. This is the location then of that commemorative service on the final day. There was a lot of construction going on. It was really hard to hear, so when we wanted to hear our tour guide, we had to duck down a side street. But on the day of the commemoration, it was a holiday in Zurich. It's Ascension Day is a holiday, and so all the work was stopped, and so we didn't have to worry about the noise that day. Neustadtgasse, or Newstead Street. This is the street where the house was, where the first baptisms took place. Or the first rebaptisms, I guess. And here's the plaque overlooking the Limmat River, where commemorating the spot where Felix Manz was drowned for his faith. You could climb up and get a higher up view from an upper park overlooking the city. And there's the Grossmünster Cathedral. And then we visited a nearby monastery. This was a community where about 40 monks lived in this very ornate building, and we heard them sing their prayers in chant form, which was quite fascinating. This was another supper of raclette, which is another way of eating potatoes and melted cheese together. I can go into details if you want, but it's really, you put the cheese on that heated platter, and then when it's melted, you scrape it off onto your potatoes or whatever else you're eating. There you go. All right, so we had one more tour day. We drove to Schleitheim, to a museum that houses one of the earliest copies of the Schleitheim Confession, one of the earliest summaries of key Anabaptist beliefs. That's it on the left. And then this was another well-done museum, impressive collection and display of archaeological, cultural, and religious artifacts. One of the things that we really took note of is how so many of the places where Anabaptist history is preserved, it's done by people that aren't even Anabaptists. They're just local historians who really care about preserving history, and that was the case here as well. We visited the Rhine Falls. It happened to be raining that day, so we didn't spend as much time there as we would have. And then we drove to Beretsville to hike up to one of the Anabaptist caves. And it was raining. We pretty much did the whole hike in the rain. Somehow that felt fitting to just feel a little bit of the adversity that might have been part of early Anabaptist experience of needing to worship in secret. Met up with some brown Swiss cows along the way. And some pilgrim ahead of us had left a little vase of flowers. And there was a cascade of water pouring down over the front of the cave, so that was kind of a beautiful sound. And here we celebrated communion, and I had the privilege of being asked to lead that service, so that was really meaningful for me. There were some other pilgrims up there too at the same time, so they just joined in with us. This was our last supper as a group before our final celebration day. So this is the Grossmünster Cathedral Plaza on the day of the 500th anniversary celebration. And I know I've told this story to a few of you about how I didn't get in. I waited in line for probably over 2 hours. There were a bunch of workshops and activities you could go to throughout the day celebrating this anniversary. Was all facilitated by Mennonite World Conference staff. Sarah was a big part of shaping all of that. There were more people than could fit in the Grossmünster. So the joke was, you know, look at this, all these people lined up to go to church and we can't all get in, and some are turned away and have to go to other sites. So the picture on the right is the church where I ended up watching on the live stream, and that's, I think, where I ran into the Kane family. We watched it on live stream. The live stream was very well done, but of course it felt disappointing not to have been in the Grossmünster Cathedral for the service. These are the folks that did get in, and of course there were some teasing texts of the sheep and the goats, and the sheep that got in and the goats that got left out, and all the rest of that. Some people actually ended up going back to their hotel rooms and watching it on their phones, or just standing in the plaza outside the church and watching on their phones. A number of people commented that it didn't feel like an Anabaptist service, but we had to be reminded that the Reformed Church was hosting us, and this was their building, this was their church, and it was all about reconciliation between Reformed and Mennonite and Lutheran and Mennonite and Catholic and Mennonite. There was representatives from all those faith traditions there. And so it didn't maybe feel like what we would think of as an Anabaptist service, but it was mostly about reconciliation. And so these are my final pictures on the morning before we left. And I think I will just say that a couple of things that it left me thinking about this whole experience. One is the question of where's the line between radical and grassroots and passionate, reformed-minded, prophetic, countercultural ideas and extremism and revolution and violence? And how do you know where to find that difference? It was, I think, important to see some of that more ugly part of our history. I think sometimes we've tended to have a bit of a shiny view of our history, and I think there's a newer generation of Mennonite scholars who are challenging us to actually look at the darker part of our story as well, and to reflect on that in a way that helps us to understand maybe the dangers of some of the paths we can go down if we're not careful. You know, we have maybe more of an idealistic vision of the Anabaptist story from some of our scholars from a generation or so back, and now I think newer scholars are helping us to critique that, but also to still claim what is of value in that tradition. And I think just the last thing I'll say, I think from this tour I have a greater appreciation again for our Anabaptist history. It's amazing to have an opportunity to be in those places, to touch those historical documents, to walk those streets, be in those buildings, see that landscape. And it's renewed in me, I think, an interest in continuing to ask the question, how Anabaptist are we? And, you know, as I craft a sermon, is this an Anabaptist sermon? What kinds of things are we doing that continue to offer the gift that the Anabaptist tradition has to the rest of the world right now? What are those gifts, and how can we share them? So it was an amazing experience for me. It was my first time to Europe, and makes me want to go back again, and be happy to take any questions you have. I know we are at 2 o'clock now, so we don't want to make this go too much longer, but if there's time for a question or two, we can do that.
Thank you, Janet. I haven't experienced any of this, and it was very meaningful to get an overview from you. Anybody want to share a feeling or a question that came to mind, or a comment from your own time there?
Yes, just want to add my thank you, Janet. I think, was it in Amsterdam, Dan, you talked about how at some point there was some acceptance of Anabaptists. But was it a period of maybe 50 years before they started fitting in, becoming wealthy? I was just struck by how short a time frame it was before there was some significant changes, it seems to me.
And I am not an expert on Dutch history, and I don't know if I have those dates. But by 1570 we have the Dutch Republic, and I think by the 1600s for sure there's more of that acceptance and Mennonites thriving. Some of you might know that story better than I do. But yeah, another part of the story that's interesting, you know, going from the persecuted minority to, you know, part of the mainstream and prosperous, maybe even higher levels of society, if you will, prospering, and again, there too come different, right? Because it was those Mennonites in the Netherlands then who were wealthier, who were actually able then to help the Swiss Mennonites who were leaving and heading to North America. So, you know, their means and resources helped the Swiss people to get out of there. So, you know, there's all kinds of different angles to those stories. Yeah.
You said one of the town's names was Aspirin. Does that have anything to do with the medicine?
That is a fantastic question, and I have no idea. I don't think the spelling was quite the same. I'd have to look that up. That's a good question.
Sounds like someone was paying close attention.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? James.
I was wondering how large the congregations are that are meeting in those those hidden churches.
Yeah, good question. How long, like the ones that the active Mennonite churches that we saw? The Langnau Church, I'm going to say that maybe there were like 2 main sections like this and then a little bit more, so maybe around that size. A lot of young folks there. A little disappointing to me, when we got there, we sang a traditional hymn, and it sounded amazing, and then they had a worship band that led the rest of the music. And I don't want to disparage worship bands. They have their place and, you know, can lead all kinds of lovely musical experiences, but it just felt a little bit disappointing after we had sung together this wonderful hymn, and it sounded so great, and then that wasn't the style of worship in that service at all. What was quite striking was I went to a workshop on secularism and how European culture is becoming more and more secularized. And, you know, they talk about in the birthplace of Anabaptism in Europe, there may not be Mennonite congregations left there in a couple of decades. They're so small and far between. The congregation that hosted us in the Netherlands was quite small, I think, and probably more seniors than not, so aging as well. And I think when we look at the Netherlands, probably Canada is not far behind in terms of our path of secularization. So it is an interesting question, you know, how will there be Anabaptist Mennonite churches left in Europe in another couple decades? In some ways, it doesn't look like it. So it was quite the contrast to that, you know, when all these Anabaptist Mennonites converge on Zurich and we can't all get into the church we want to worship in, right? And you have people turned away. It's quite a juxtaposition.
I was just going to say that it was interesting to see those cages on that church. I didn't get to go there, but MWC keeps on talking about changing its name to be more inclusive to the whole Anabaptist, all of our members, because not all of them have Mennonite in the name. And whenever changing it to include the word Anabaptism, some people in Europe don't like that because they think of that part of the history and they know that part of the history that the rest of us don't. And so they're like, oh, but we're different from the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists are the violent ones that do that. So it's just interesting to learn more about that history, because that's one of the reasons why, well, that nobody can agree on what would be the appropriate name to change it to. But yeah, because we have to have consensus.
Yeah. There's a scope of who is part of the Anabaptist Mennonite story worldwide. Yeah.
Janet, early in the slide set, you had shown a variety of pictures, and you had commented how everywhere you looked, you saw churches, church spires, cathedrals, and so on. And given the level of secularization in Europe, how are these buildings being maintained? Is it all government money that maintains them, or I'm assuming many of them don't have sufficient congregational support to look after them, or perhaps I'm wrong?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't really know. I suspect there are, you know, Catholic cathedrals that are maintained by the Catholic Church and Reformed and Lutherans as well. Maybe others of you know more about that than I do. Yeah, and you know, I think like around here too, cathedrals get used for different purposes, maybe concerts and that kind of thing. Tourist. Wolfgang, here's our Europe expert. He can maybe offer some insight.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert, but I know that in Germany and countries like Switzerland, and when you have your when you fill out your form where you work to what your tax deductions are, you have to put your denomination down, and that funds the church.
So on your tax form, you put down what denomination you are, and that can fund churches.
Seeing no other hands, I'm going to just thank you for sharing with us, and also for the questions and comments you raised. It does leave us with food for thought to ponder what is the essence of Anabaptism and what is our prayer for our own faith community here to continue to be relevant and vital in the community, and how God is moving in ways that we don't even see yet. We are both bearing fruit and seeds buried under the ground at the same time. Thank you for coming and staying this afternoon, and may the Lord bless you and give you what you need for the week. Amen.
Thanks.